receiving a letter from the man who murdered your child. Not a ransom note, not an apology. A detailed account describing exactly how he killed her and how he spent the next 9 days eating her. For 6 years, one family searched desperately for answers. Then one envelope changed everything. Inside was a confession so horrifying that even seasoned detectives struggled to finish reading it. The man who wrote it wasn't hiding in some dark basement. He was an elderly house painter, a quiet grandfather, soft-spoken, polite, the kind of man neighbors trusted. His name was Albert Fish, one of America's most terrifying serial killers. Before we begin, I need to warn you that today's story contains discussions of child abuse, torture, murder, cannibalism, sexual violence, and severe mental illness. Some details have been softened out of respect for the victims, but this case remains one of the most disturbing in modern criminal history. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. This is the story of Albert Fish, a man whose crimes became so monstrous that newspapers gave him names like the Gray Man, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and perhaps the most fitting of them all, the Boogeyman. But monsters aren't born overnight. To understand how Albert Fish became one of history's most infamous killers, we have to begin decades earlier, with a childhood filled with neglect, abuse, and trauma. Albert Fish wasn't actually born Albert. When he entered the world on May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C., his name was Hamilton Howard Fish. He was the youngest of 5 children born to Randall and Ellen Fish. His family history was troubled long before Albert arrived. Several close relatives reportedly suffered from severe mental illnesses. Some experienced hallucinations, while others were institutionalized. Modern psychologists have debated for years how much Albert's later behavior came from genetics and how much came from the environment he grew up in. Unfortunately, that environment wasn't much better. His father, Randall, was already 75 years old when Albert was born. 5 years later, he died. Losing the family's primary provider devastated Albert's mother. Whether because of grief, existing mental illness, or both, Ellen eventually became unable to care for her children. Albert was sent to St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C. For him, that was the beginning of something much darker. Life inside 19th century orphanages was often brutal. Corporal punishment was common. Humiliation was considered discipline. Children who stepped out of line could expect severe beatings. Albert later claimed that he was whipped regularly by both staff and older children. Whether every detail of his recollections can be verified is impossible to know. What is clear is that Albert consistently described the orphanage as a place of relentless abuse. Psychologists would later believe these experiences fundamentally altered the way he understood pain. Over time, something disturbing happened. Instead of fearing punishment, Albert began associating pain with pleasure. Years later, he admitted that being beaten eventually became sexually arousing. For a child, that's an unimaginable psychological distortion. But it wouldn't stop there. Albert also began hurting himself. He burned his own body, swallowed sharp objects, and developed an obsession with punishment that would only intensify as he grew older. Looking back, investigators would point to this period as one of the earliest warning signs. Around the age of 10, Albert's mother recovered enough to bring him home. In theory, this should have been a fresh start. Instead, the damage appeared to have already taken hold. He continued to harm himself. He struggled socially. He became fascinated by stories of violent criminals. According to later accounts, he also spent increasing amounts of time watching young boys in public bathhouses. It's important to remember that many children experience trauma without ever becoming violent. Abuse does not create serial killers. But in Albert's case, the trauma combined with severe psychological problems that would continue escalating for the rest of his life. And before long, he left home entirely. As a young adult, Albert moved to New York City. He supported himself through various jobs, including house painting. For a period, he also worked as a male prostitute, exposing him to an underground world that was largely hidden from public view. Around this time, Albert claimed he met a ship captain who told horrifying stories from the famine in northern China during the late 1800s. According to Albert, the captain described acts of cannibalism during the famine and spoke about human flesh with disturbing enthusiasm. Whether every detail detail of that conversation actually happened has never been independently verified, but Albert insisted it left a lasting impression on him. From that point forward, his fascination with cannibalism appeared to grow. He began reading everything he could find about violent crime, torture, and human anatomy. It wasn't simply curiosity anymore. It was becoming an obsession. And yet, from the outside, his life seemed surprisingly normal. In 1898, Albert married a woman named Anna. Together, they would have 6 children. Neighbors described him as polite, hardworking, quiet. He painted houses for a living, went to church, raised a family. Nothing about him suggested that behind closed doors, his fantasies were becoming increasingly violent. As the years passed, those fantasies would evolve into something far more dangerous because Albert Fish no longer wanted to imagine violence. He wanted to experience it. When Albert Fish entered his 50s, something had changed. The fantasies he carried for decades were no longer enough. According to his own later confessions, he'd already attacked numerous victims by this point. Investigators were never able to verify many of those claims, but there was little doubt that his violence had escalated dramatically. He had become incredibly patient. He wasn't the kind of killer who acted impulsively. He observed, he planned. He chose victims who were unlikely to receive sustained attention from police. Children from struggling families, people living on society's margins, those he believed wouldn't be searched for as aggressively. And perhaps most terrifying of all, Albert Fish didn't look dangerous. By now, he was an aging man with thinning gray hair, a large mustache, gentle blue eyes, and an unusually soft voice. People described them as polite, helpful, even grandfatherly. It was the perfect disguise. On July 14, 1924, 8-year-old Francis McDonnell disappeared while playing near his home in Staten Island. Earlier that day, Francis's mother had noticed an elderly man wandering the neighborhood. She later remembered his drooping gray mustache, his strange mannerisms, the way he appeared to mumble to himself as he walked. At the time, she thought little of it. Francis never came home. Neighbors began searching nearby fields and wooded areas. Eventually, they found him. The young boy had been murdered. Investigators quickly realized this wasn't a robbery or an accident. The crime scene suggested something far darker. The killer had mutilated the body, removing part of one of Francis's thighs before disappearing without leaving enough evidence to identify himself. The newspapers exploded with speculation. Who could commit such an act? Police had almost nothing to work with. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses willing to identify a suspect, no obvious motive. The mysterious elderly man simply vanished. Years later, Albert Fish would confess to killing Francis and claimed he had taken part of the child's body home to eat. Whether every detail of that confession was accurate remains impossible to prove, but investigators ultimately believed he was responsible. The public, however, knew nothing about Albert Fish yet. Francis's murder shocked New York, and the next case terrified it. On February 11, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney was playing in the hallway of his Brooklyn apartment building with another young boy. At some point, Billy disappeared. The other child survived. When adults asked where Billy had gone, the frightened little boy answered with just 2 words: the boogeyman. At first, many dismissed the statement as something a frightened child might imagine. But Billy was gone. Witnesses later reported seeing an elderly man leading a small child away from the neighborhood. That was the only meaningful lead investigators ever received. Billy Gaffney was never found. No body, no crime scene, nothing. For years, the case remained one of New York's greatest mysteries. Later, during questioning, Albert Fish calmly described what he claimed had happened. According to his confession, he lured Billy to an isolated area, left him restrained overnight, returned the following day with homemade torture instruments. After murdering the child, he dismembered the body and cooked portions of it over several days. Detectives had no physical evidence remaining to verify every aspect of his story, but many investigators believed the confession contained details only Billy's killer could have known. The public reaction was immediate. The newspapers needed a name for this nightmare. Some began calling him the boogeyman. What's difficult to understand today is how someone capable of these crimes remained free for so long. The answer lies partly in the time period. This was the 1920s. There were no nationwide fingerprint databases, no DNA testing. Police departments rarely shared information effectively. Missing children weren't always connected across jurisdictions. Albert understood these weaknesses. He moved constantly for work. He painted houses, took temporary jobs, used different names, blended into neighborhoods, then disappeared before anyone had reason to remember him. He wasn't a criminal who attracted attention. He looked exactly like someone you would trust. And that may have been his greatest weapon. In 1928, Albert Fish found a new hunting ground. Newspaper classified advertisements. One ad, placed by an 18-year-old named Edward Budd, caught his attention. Edward was searching for work. His family struggled financially and jobs were difficult to find. Albert responded using the false name Frank Howard. He claimed to own a farm on Long Island and promised good wages, room and board. For the Budd family, it sounded like an incredible opportunity. Albert arranged to visit their home personally. When he arrived, he brought gifts. He smiled, he laughed, he ate dinner with the family. Everyone liked him almost immediately, especially one person, Edward's 10-year-old sister, Grace. Grace Budd was shy, quiet, small for her age. She reportedly struggled with anemia and often lacked the energy other children had. She immediately warmed to the elderly visitor. She chatted with him comfortably, sat beside him, trusted him completely. Albert noticed almost instantly. His original target had been Edward, but as he watched Grace, his plan changed. Before leaving, Albert casually mentioned that he was attending a birthday party for his niece later that day. He suggested Grace come along. There would be cake, games, other children. He promised to bring her safely home afterward. Today, no parent would likely accept such an invitation, but 1928 was a different world. Neighbors trusted one another more readily. People often believed an elderly gentleman was harmless. Grace's parents agreed. They watched their daughter walk away beside Albert Fish. She smiled, she waved goodbye. It was the last time they would ever see her alive. As evening turned into night, Grace didn't return. At first, her parents feared there had been an accident. By the next morning, they contacted police. Detectives immediately searched for Frank Howard. The problem was that no one by that name existed. The farm didn't exist, the story didn't exist. Everything the old man had told them had been a lie. Investigators collected fingerprints from a drinking glass, recovered a telegram the suspect had previously sent, interviewed neighbors, followed every lead they could find. But the trail ended almost immediately. The mysterious old man disappeared without a trace. Months became years. Grace Budd's case slowly turned into one of New York City's most heartbreaking unsolved disappearances. For her family, there was always one question: what happened to Grace? They had no idea that the man responsible had been carrying the answer with him the entire time. For 6 long years, the family lived in uncertainty. No body, no suspect, no answers. Every knock at the door carried a tiny bit of hope. Every passing year made that hope smaller. And in 1934, for reasons no one has ever fully understood, Albert Fish decided to tell them. An envelope addressed to Grace's parents arrived. There was no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter. At first, it looked almost polite. But as they continued reading, their worst fears became reality. Let's dive into the infamous confession letter. How one small mistake led detectives straight to Albert Fish, his arrest, the psychiatric examinations, the trial, execution, and the lasting legacy of one of America's most disturbing serial killers. The letter began by reminding the Budd family exactly who had written it. The man calling himself Frank Howard, the same man who had taken Grace 6 years earlier. He described arriving at their home, sharing lunch with the family, watching Grace climb into his lap. Then came the sentence that would horrify investigators for decades. The moment she sat on my lap, I decided I would eat her. The rest of the letter became increasingly disturbing. I will put the full text on screen so you can pause and read it if you want to. He claimed he had taken Grace to an empty house outside the city, waited until they were alone, murdered her, dismembered her, then spent more than a week cooking and eating her remains. It wasn't simply a confession. It felt like he wanted the family to experience every ounce of pain he had caused. Even experienced detectives struggled to finish reading it. For Grace's parents, it was unimaginable. But hidden inside that confession, Albert Fish had made a mistake. One tiny mistake, and it would finally expose him. Detectives carefully examined every inch of the letter. The handwriting matched earlier correspondence from Frank Howard that confirmed they were dealing with the same man. But it wasn't the handwriting that solved the case. It was the envelope. Printed on it was the name of a private chauffeurs association in Manhattan. Police immediately visited the building. At first, none of the members matched the handwriting. It seemed like another dead end. Then a janitor mentioned something unusual. Some official stationery had gone missing months earlier. He believed the former tenant had taken several unused envelopes before moving out. That information changed everything. Detectives tracked down the boarding house where the former tenant had lived. The landlady remembered him immediately, an older man, quiet, odd. She also remembered his name, Albert Fish. Even more importantly, she told the detectives he was expected to return in a few days to collect some mail, so they waited. On December 13, 1934, Albert Fish walked calmly back to the boarding house. He had no idea police were waiting. Detectives stepped forward, identified themselves, and arrested him without incident. There was no dramatic chase, no desperate attempt to escape. He simply surrendered, almost as though he'd been expecting this day all along. What happened next stunned investigators. Instead of denying everything, Albert started talking and talking and talking. He confessed to killing Grace Budd, then Francis McDonnell, then Billy Gaffney. He volunteered details that had never been released publicly. He described locations, methods, victims. He even claimed he had murdered children across multiple states. Some estimates from his own statements reached as high as 100 victims. Modern historians remain skeptical of that number. Many of those murders were never verified. Some investigators believed Albert exaggerated to increase his notoriety. Others feared he might actually be telling the truth. To this day, no one knows the real number. Albert eventually led police to the abandoned cottage where Grace had been killed. Investigators recovered human remains consistent with those of a young girl. Dental records confirmed what Grace's parents had dreaded for 6 years. Their daughter had finally been found. The mystery was over. The nightmare was real. Once in custody, Albert underwent extensive psychiatric examinations. Doctors agreed on one thing. He suffered from profound psychological disorders. He experienced hallucinations, religious delusions, extreme sexual sadism, compulsive self-harm. During medical examinations, X-rays revealed dozens of needles embedded inside his pelvis. Some had been there for years. Yet despite his obvious mental illness, psychiatrists ultimately concluded that Albert understood the difference between right and wrong. He knew his crimes were illegal. He simply chose to commit them anyway. That finding would become the deciding factor during his trial. Albert Fish's murder trial began in March of 1935. Newspapers covered every single day of the proceedings. Hundreds gathered outside the courthouse hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had become America's boogeyman. His attorneys attempted an insanity defense. They argued that no sane person could commit crimes of such unimaginable brutality. The prosecution disagreed. They argued that Albert planned his crimes carefully. He used false identities. He selected vulnerable victims. He avoided detection for years. Those weren't the actions of someone incapable of understanding consequences. Perhaps the most heartbreaking testimony came from Grace Budd's father. Still devastated years after losing his daughter, he identified Albert Fish as the man who had walked out his home with Grace. The courtroom fell silent. After 10 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for only a short time. Albert Fish was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. Most prisoners fear execution. Albert Fish did not. According to witnesses, he spoke about the electric chair with unsettling curiosity. He reportedly described death as an experience he had never had before. One final sensation, one last thrill. On January 16, 1936, inside Sing Sing prison, Albert Fish was executed by electric chair. He was 65 years old. With that, the life of one of America's most notorious serial killers finally came to an end. But his story didn't. Nearly a century later, Albert Fish remains one of the most studied criminal cases in American history. Not because he was the most prolific, not because he was the smartest, but because he represented something uniquely terrifying. He didn't hide behind intimidation, he hid behind kindness. He looked like someone's grandfather. He smiled, he spoke softly, he earned trust before destroying it. His case also changed the way investigators viewed crimes against children, offender profiling, and the role severe mental illness can play in violent crime. Yet, despite decades of research, one question still lingered. How many victims were there really? Albert claimed dozens, perhaps hundreds. Most experts believe that number was exaggerated. The truth may never be known. But one thing is certain. Albert Fish wasn't a fictional monster hiding under children's beds. He was real. He walked ordinary streets, lived among ordinary people, and for decades, almost no one suspected him. It's a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always look frightening. Sometimes it looks ordinary. If you found this story informative, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more deep dives into history's darkest true crime cases. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.